Even during the war, he maintained his excellent contacts in the Spanish and Portuguese governments. One consequence of this was that in 1940 he was sent to Madrid to persuade the Spanish to declare war. He told me at the time that he thought the total effect of any Spanish declaration of war would be minimal, a view General Halder shared. Canaris believed it would bring Germany fresh burdens rather than relief, and quite apart from that, it would slam one more door between us and the rest of the world, which to an intelligence chief was a matter of personal importance. He was very relieved at the failure of his mission. The latter part of 1940 was taken up with preparing for our invasion of Greece, which was planned for the spring of 1941, using Bulgarian territory as a jumping-off place. After the Führer directive had been issued for that operation, we turned our detailed attention to the coming Russian campaign. I myself was preoccupied with logistic problems, the details of reserves and transportation, and later with the basic objectives of the army groups. Hitler launched his invasion of Russia on June 21, 1941. In its early weeks, it was obvious that we had caught the Russians off balance, and there was jubilation at Hitler's headquarters as the front line advanced further and further into Soviet territory. Within our army's general staff, a special branch had been set up under Colonel Eberhard Kinzel to control intelligence on the Russian front and contiguous areas. Kinzel, however, found it difficult to get along with General Halder, as entries in Halder's diaries indicate, and he failed to adapt his intelligence organization to keep pace with the rapid war of movement that characterized the early months of the campaign. The outcome of Halder's dissatisfaction with Kinzel, as I have mentioned, was that on April 1, 1942, I was appointed to succeed him as head of Foreign Armies East. The general military situation by early April 1942 was this. We had succeeded in stabilizing our front line in the important sectors held by Army Groups Centre and North, where the front had been dangerously weakened during the disastrous winter months. The setbacks there had led to considerable loss of ground, and much equipment had been lost in the retreats. But far worse was the effect of the winter crisis on the German soldier, who after 2 years of victorious advance had for the first time experienced a setback, if not an outright defeat. Even though the real culprits were the severe weather conditions together with an initial shortage of winter equipment and greatly reduced divisional strength, there were bound to be dangerous psychological results. But it was not only for psychological reasons that we had to regain the initiative as soon as possible. There was a real military threat. The Soviet counter-offensive, which began in November 1941, and came as no surprise to Foreign Armies East, showed that Stalin was not adverse to switching strength from the Far East to relieve the pressure on his Western Front if need be. Moreover, the winter fighting had displayed the Russians' capacity for improvisation. Any respite we gave them now would disproportionately add to their fighting strength, which had declined severely during the summer of 1941. If we could not take the offensive, the conflict would be infinitely prolonged, and with it would emerge the danger of war on two fronts. We could not expect the intervention of strong American forces to be delayed later than 1943. Thus, by the start of 1942, Hitler faced a situation similar to that confronting the Supreme Army Command during the Great War in the spring of 1917. During my tour of duty in the operations branch, we had the job of determining where and with what units our new offensive ought to be mounted. We concluded that despite every effort on its part, the Wehrmacht and its supporting armaments industry would not be able to replace manpower and equipment losses fast enough to justify launching an offensive along the entire length of the Eastern Front, from the Crimea in the south to Leningrad in the north. But we believed that the divisions left confronting Britain in the west would probably get by in 1942 without needing reinforcements. We would therefore have to limit ourselves to smaller offensives, recapturing the ground lost during the winter, particularly in the Crimea and at Kharkov, and capturing Leningrad to neutralize the Baltic and strengthen our land contact with the Finns. We concluded that we ought to use the remaining divisions to attack the Russians in places where they would have to stand and fight. In the opinion of the Chief of Staff, General Halder, our attack ought to be centered on Moscow. In addition to the psychological effect, the capture of Moscow would even then, in 1942, deprive the Soviet Empire of its political nerve center and main transportation center. While it would not make it wholly impossible for the Russians to continue the fight, it would certainly hamper them considerably. There were bitter arguments with Hitler on this issue, since he insisted on an offensive in the direction of Stalingrad to eliminate the Volga as a waterway and the Caucasus. Hitler's argument was that the capture of the oil fields there would decide the war. Without them, Germany's fuel supplies would dry up within 6 months. This prediction turned out to be wrong, for even without the Caucasian oil fields, we were able to keep fighting for 2.5 years more. Even during the French campaign of 1940, Halder's relationship with Hitler had not been without friction. In the summer of 1941, it had been placed under further strain by Hitler's obstinate demand for the main military effort to be shifted to the south, at Kiev. His decision did indeed result in the greatest encirclement action ever fought, the Battle of Kiev in August 1941, in which nearly 2 million Russian prisoners were taken. But this modern canaille remained a local victory, upon which were to follow the winter catastrophe outside Moscow and the failure of the 1941 campaign. The controversy over this new 1942 campaign exacerbated this conflict until it became unbearable for either of them, and it resulted in a final parting of their ways on September 24, 1942. I recall one remark Halder made to me, which vividly illustrates the feeling at the end between Hitler and his principal strategic advisor. "I will just keep contradicting Hitler until he gets rid of me. He won't listen to the voice of reason anymore." Hitler always refused his senior officers' requests to be relieved of their commands. As the Caucasus oil objectives showed, economic considerations conditioned Hitler's decisions, not the demands of war or the requirements of foreign policy, all of which spoke against the launching of sweeping operations into the Soviet hinterland. The insoluble problem of logistics once we had crossed the River Don to the south, where there was only a single railroad track and poor highways, also argued against starting such an operation. But Hitler cast all these misgivings to the winds. This was why it was vital for us to identify, confront and destroy the enemy at the onset of the offensive. The General Staff branch entrusted to me in April 1942 had to be able to brief our Supreme Command as completely, precisely and rapidly as possible on the enemy situation and on the enemy's strategic and tactical intentions. I was now head of Foreign Armies East, the intelligence branch responsible for the entire Eastern Front. I moved into Colonel Kinzel's office at the headquarters of Foreign Armies East immediately. It was a large hut in the middle of the General Staff encampment on Lake Mauersee, southwest of Angerburg in East Prussia. It was a small compound made up of wooden and brick huts in the depth of the forest, invisible to any aircraft that might pass overhead, and only a half-hour's shuttle train journey away from Hitler's main headquarters, the Wolf's Lair at Rastenburg. The huts were all well equipped and kept at a comfortable temperature by a main heating plant for the whole compound. An ultra-modern communications center enabled us to contact Wehrmacht units anywhere in occupied Europe within seconds. My office was in the hut directly opposite General Halder's living and office quarters. Its center was filled with a big map table, and my own desk was in an alcove at one end, illuminated by powerful lamps that caused anybody who came within range of them to perspire. In peacetime, the branch's job had been to build up the most comprehensive picture it could of the defense and armaments potential of the eastern countries under its surveillance. This was done in conjunction with other agencies both inside and outside the Army's General Staff. The branch had circulated reports to keep officers and men adequately informed on conditions they must expect, for example, geological or meteorological data. Of particular value was any data we could gather on the so-called fighting quality of each enemy unit, the beginning of what we now refer to as a psychopolitical appreciation of the enemy. The information we had filed on the Soviet fighting man in this respect during peacetime was to be wholly confirmed during the first year of the Russian campaign. We had predicted that the Russian soldier would be tough and frugal, and that his modest material needs would enable him to fight on long after the battle itself was lost. We anticipated, too, that indoctrination would affect the officer corps, but not the bulk of the recruits, and this also proved correct. Moreover, we correctly predicted that when Soviet defeats occurred, the desertion rate would increase. We were not concerned solely with the Soviet Union, however. During the early war years under my predecessor, we were required to provide digests on the armed forces and equipment of all the Scandinavian countries, and on Czechoslovakia and the Balkan countries as well. We reported regularly on their fortifications, their attitudes toward Germany, and their internal political situations. In addition to compiling the order of battle reports on the regular Eastern armies confronting us, we had to conduct intelligence work against the growing partisan activity in Yugoslavia. During the early part of my office, the branch was ordered to include the gathering of intelligence on a powerful new enemy, the United States. I recall that the American secret rearmament plan, of which only 8 copies existed, came to our attention as early as the spring of 1942, simply through our careful sifting of the American press. The U.S. General Wedemeyer, who had attended our staff college in Berlin from 1936 to 1938, and who was perhaps one of the most outstanding American strategists of World War II, told me in 1960 that nobody had ever established how this top-secret document came into the hands of the press. At the time, he was the principal general staff officer in the U.S. Army's operations branch. In the course of the affair, he suffered probably the most nerve-wracking hours of his life, but he finally emerged from the investigation without a stain on his name. He made it clear to me that the investigation indicated that the leak was somewhere in President Roosevelt's immediate entourage. In the middle of June 1942, I was able to give Halder a bulky report we had compiled on American strength and strategic intentions for the coming year, with photographs of U.S. tanks and landing craft, details of the U.S. Army's expansion plans, and a discussion of the shipping tonnage available for transporting American troops. At the time, we concluded, lack of shipping space would rule out any danger that the Allies could mount a full-scale second front that year. In the report, we quoted an Abwehr source in the British Embassy in Lisbon, which pointed, correctly, to the Allied intention of intensifying the bombing of Germany and of carrying out minor landing operations on the French coast. A few days later, I was able to circulate a detailed report on the U.S. Army, in which I noted that a European theatre of operations had been activated under Brigadier General Eisenhower. I went on to emphasize that, in the near future, we must take into account the fact that American forces will appear in moderate strength at first. Our principal intelligence target was, of course, the Soviet Union. In peacetime, in order to build up an exact picture of the Russian units, we had used every possible source of information: the files of the Abwehr, the dispatches of our military attachés, the reports circulated by the Foreign Ministry. Of course, we had also exploited the available non-secret publications, even though these were subject to stringent press censorship. By careful analysis, we could often extract valuable facts to extend our knowledge beyond that obtained from secret sources. Despite the difficulties imposed on him by the Soviet Union's extensive counter-espionage, and by Hitler's absolute prohibition against espionage activity in the Soviet Union after his pact with Stalin was signed in 1939, my predecessor, Colonel Kinzel, had already succeeded in building up a relatively accurate picture of the Russian defences, order of battle, and mobilization measures, and of Moscow's strategic planning. It was on the basis of this information that our Barbarossa campaign plan had been developed and adjusted to meet each changing circumstance. Kinzel had also instituted detailed surveys of Soviet manpower and industrial reserves, and I found these reports of particular value when I took over. As we became more deeply embroiled in the conflict with Russia, we extended the activities of our staff and task force. We assembled thousands of files on Soviet armed forces and NKVD units and compiled intricate card indices on high-ranking Soviet officers. Maps were drawn indicating communications networks, radio links, poison gas depots, principal lines of advance, and the location of NKVD agents. Finally, we made detailed comparisons between German and Russian units of similar size. 7 days after I took over Foreign Armies East, I reported in detail to General Halder on the Russian forces' rate of reinforcement and their aircraft movements over the previous month, and then I discussed with him the way I proposed to work in the future. He told me, with some emphasis, that he expected not only a thorough estimate of the daily situation, but also a long-term appreciation of the enemy's strategic intentions and capabilities. This was an important innovation. In a note appended to a collection of these appreciation reports, I explained in December 1944, at the beginning of the campaign against the Soviet Union, Foreign Armies East did not issue any written appreciation reports on the situation, as the enemy's command showed that it was totally dependent on German operations and was incapable of any strategic initiative of its own. Apart from its verbal reporting, therefore, this branch was able to limit itself to underscore issuing daily digests until the beginning of the winter of 1942. When the Soviet command managed to regain the initiative on some sectors of the front at the beginning of the winter of 1941-42, the branch began to issue a daily report on enemy trends, in which some attempt was made to go into an appreciation of the enemy's probable intentions. As the war progressed, however, it became necessary for the appreciation of enemy plans, which had previously been discussed verbally each day with the Chief of the General Staff, to be set down in writing. From April 11, 1942, onward, therefore, a brief appreciation report on the enemy situation was prepared each day and circulated to the authorities concerned: Chief of the General Staff, Chief of the Operations Branch, intelligence officers at Army Group level, Luftwaffe Operations Staff. In addition to these, we prepared a comprehensive appreciation report on the enemy situation at various intervals, usually 4 to 8 weeks, so that as the war went on, our command would have material on the actions to be expected of the enemy over long periods of time. After a short time as head of the branch, I realized that there was much room for improvement if Halder's wishes were to be met, and that a number of organizational and psychological problems would have to be overcome. The main psychological problem was the traditional lack of regard for the military intelligence branch, particularly for intelligence procurement. I was originally not entirely innocent myself in this regard. The effects of such an attitude were evidenced by the small number of active officers in military intelligence in peacetime. The Army's organization scheme of January 1939 shows only 7 officers in Branch 12, Foreign Armies East. At Army Corps level, there was the Abwehroffizier, officer the Joint Military Intelligence Counter-Espionage officer, usually a young Army captain on a posting to the General Staff. The peacetime organization made no provision for an enemy intelligence expert at divisional level. In wartime, this position was usually occupied by a reserve officer, who often performed amazingly well. Of course, the disdain for this work was wholly unjust, as the enemy intelligence expert, especially in the higher echelons, had to think with 2 brains at once if he was to perform his assignment properly. It was not enough to know the precise military units and equipment opposing him. He had to be able to forecast the enemy's intentions, and this called for a subtle empathy with the enemy's mentality and a detailed knowledge of the enemy's command tactics. He then had to be able to put all his facts convincingly to his superiors, acting the role of devil's advocate. This was not without its difficulties, for the staff intelligence officer was usually junior in both age and rank to the operations officer and chief of staff in his echelon. Soon after taking office, I therefore proposed to General Halder that the military intelligence officer should be given the same rank and seniority as the operations officer, which was that of a principal officer. This request was granted, particularly in the higher levels like army groups and armies. While the operations officer continued to be the primus inter pares, the military intelligence officer at least had the same rank. The result was an increase in the latter's influence. His words were treated with greater respect than before, and he could add more weight to his appreciation of the enemy's intentions. The second deficiency, in my view, was the inadequate cooperation existing between Foreign Armies East and other important intelligence agencies, particularly Admiral Canaris's Abwehr. For example, the Abwehr repeatedly forwarded to me information of considerable interest, but their evaluation of it left much to be desired. This deficiency was not caused by any negligence or lack of interest on the German side. Hitherto, the war's course had seen the initiative in German hands. Each campaign had in turn resulted in rapid and overwhelming victories for German arms. It was therefore natural, as I indicated in my December 1944 note, for the attention of the organs of military intelligence and tactical command to be primarily focused on the events of the day and the immediate future. There was little the Abwehr could contribute to this kind of work, simply because of the time it took to communicate the results of its investigations. During this period of fast-moving operations, we were largely reliant on forward intelligence and reconnaissance by the combat units themselves. This satisfied our needs, although in retrospect I am amazed at the accuracy of the results we obtained from such primitive material. The failure of the summer campaign of 1941 ended that phase. The enemy had gained the initiative, at least for the time being, and we were confronted for the first time by the need to develop a long-range analysis of the enemy's capabilities and strategic intentions, if we were not to run up against unpleasant surprises. It was in this situation that I took up personal contact with Canaris and persuaded him to extend the areas in which we could collaborate. He was formerly head of the OKW's Foreign and Intelligence Office, or Abwehr. The former section attended to the affairs of our attachés in friendly and neutral countries. The latter section, the Abwehr, was subdivided into 3 branches: Branch 1 Espionage under Colonel Piekenbrock, Branch 2 Sabotage under Colonel Lehausen, Branch 3 Counter-Espionage under Colonel von Bentivegni. The Abwehr had its own intelligence network, operating as did the British service largely with freelance agents of proved reliability. But Canaris had no organization for analyzing the intelligence data he received. The raw report was circulated to those who seemed most likely to be interested, with the result that any piece of intelligence depended for its effect solely on the sound judgment of its recipient. In the absence of any systematic process of analysis operating in conjunction with the other sources of material at the Abwehr's disposal, some items might be grossly overrated by the recipient, and others wholly ignored. It was the lesson I learned during my collaboration with Canaris's Abwehr system that moved me, when I set up the Galen organization after 1945, to establish an efficient section of analysts inside the organization. And I did what I could to dispel the heresy that secret services should concern themselves solely with secret sources, and pay no attention to the freely available, open material available from newspaper stands and bookstores throughout the world. Canaris, of course, was not without difficulties of his own by 1942. The destruction of many of his networks in countries that became our enemies with the outbreak of war made his agency's work harder, but not impossible. In the United States, the FBI had closed down virtually every German contact, but as I have said, the garrulous newspapers and magazines of that nation made it possible for him to bridge the gap until he could rebuild his networks there. A further difficulty confronting him was that since 1933, the Nazi Party in the guise of the so-called Foreign Organization, Auslandsorganisation, and Himmler's SD, Sicherheitsdienst, Security Service, had been attempting to establish rival networks in a manner that verged frequently on the dilettante. Canaris was in a weak position, as the OKW's chiefs did not give him the support he needed. The Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, in which the Gestapo, criminal police and SD were unofficially combined in 1936, and which Himmler formally established on September 27, 1939, in particular, had struggled to get control of espionage and counter-espionage. In 1933, Hitler had granted the request of his defense minister that the defense ministry alone be responsible for counter-espionage and counter-sabotage operations to protect the state and its national economy and armed forces. But by 1935, it was plain that Himmler and his trusty police chief Reinhard Heydrich were not inclined to heed Hitler's ordinance. Thus, 1935 had seen the creation of Special Bureau Stein, which conducted investigations into suspected treason cases on behalf of both the Gestapo and SD and the armed forces. It was built into the RSHA as an ad hoc bureau, with the express aim of encroaching on the Abwehr's preserves. Abwehr's response was to turn its scrutiny onto Stein himself, but he fled abroad, and using the codename Pfeiffer, tried to work for the Poles and British, without enjoying much success, These clear inroads into his authority caused Canaris to get together with Dr. Werner Best of the RSHA. Together they hammered out a basis for collaboration, the 10 Commandments of 1936, which established guidelines for the cooperation of the Abwehr with the Gestapo and SD, and clearly set out their individual responsibilities. 2 years later, the SD's carefully camouflaged Foreign Intelligence Service was refashioned into Branch 6 of the RSHA, and this was taken over by Walter Schellenberg in June 1942. In May 1942, or about a month after I became head of Foreign Armies East, a new agreement was reached between the SD and the Abwehr, allegedly based on a 10-point program drafted by Schellenberg. The negotiations were conducted by Canaris and Colonel von Bentivegni on the one side, and the head of Branch 4 of the RSHA, Heinrich Müller, on the other. It was only now that the SD's espionage activity abroad became legal, and Canaris had to concede its permission to undertake military intelligence work abroad as well. In a way, this concession was the beginning of the end for the Abwehr, and heralded the takeover 2 years later of the whole intelligence service by Himmler's RSHA. Without doubt, Walter Schellenberg was the driving force behind the SD's struggle for ascendancy in espionage and sabotage operations. Canaris always warned me that Schellenberg was a dangerous adversary, but he was a man of clever and winning ways, and many people spoke of his knack for intelligence work. I heard that he had gotten along well with Canaris's man during the years of cooperation between the Abwehr and the state police authorities. But all that changed when Schellenberg became head of Himmler's intelligence service. Canaris, high-principled as he was himself, probably took Schellenberg's loyalty for granted. I saw that my first task was to establish closer contact between Canaris's Abwehr networks and the various military commands. In peacetime, apart from informal contacts within the Defense Ministry, the Abwehr had been linked to the military commands only at the military district level, in the person of the Abwehroffizier officer. With mobilization, even this tenuous link went by the board, as the Abwehroffizier now had to act purely as the enemy intelligence officer at the forward headquarters of the Army Corps concerned. Canaris's organization operated highly mobile forward intelligence and reconnaissance units under 3 control stations, codenamed Wally 1, Wally 2, and Wally 3, each with a different kind of mission. I requested him to place his Abwehr units on the Eastern Front under my control, with the exception of the Wally 2 units, that is, the sabotage commandos, which I wanted nothing to do with in view of the overall situation. I told Canaris I would not interfere in any way with the running of the Abwehr units or their upkeep, but we had to find some faster way of getting their data to the fighting commands. It was typical of his unlimited readiness to cooperate that he agreed to my request without a moment's hesitation. My first step was to transfer the control station WW1 from its present site east of Warsaw to Nikolaiken, about 20 miles from the main field headquarters of the Army, OKH, at Angerburg, so that the contact between the secret intelligence units and my branch, Foreign Armies East, would be as immediate as possible. Wally 1, commanded by Major Hermann Baun, controlled the agents and special reconnaissance units operating along the whole Eastern Front. Baun himself was an undersized, brown-eyed, Russian-born German who spoke accent-free German and Russian like a second mother tongue. He remained in control of my intelligence procurement operations until the end of the war and beyond. The new organization I introduced provided a rapid flow of intelligence data from the front line to our branch, along 2 parallel channels. The first followed the military chain of L officers at each command level, and the second the Abwehr chain, with crossovers at each level. A frontline intelligence unit would report to the L officer at Army level, and simultaneously to the Abwehr's Forward Reconnaissance Command at Army Group level. The latter would then collate these reports and report in TUM to the Ley at Army Group level, and to the Abwehr's overall control station under Major Baun. In the first instance, Baun then reported to my branch, using both the reports of the forward reconnaissance units that had reached him in this way, and also the results of his own Abwehr operations. Canaris's agency, for its part, received copies of all the reports reaching Foreign Armies East. Finally, to speed the communication of reports, I ordered that the preparation of the daily intelligence summary was to begin simultaneously at every level. The result was that each LE was usually able to hand his commanding officer a complete intelligence summary by evening. An example will make this clearer. Hitler had directed that in the coming spring offensive, the breakthrough into the Caucasus came first and foremost. On April 10, 1942, in my first brief report to General Halder, I stated that the Russians would probably also concentrate their main effort in the south, although it was still not clear whether they would adopt a passive defensive strategy or would try to stall us by a surprise counterattack. A few days before von Manstein launched the German offensive on May 8th, Foreign Armies East received the following signal from the Abwehr. The 30th of April, 1942, 11:30. To Foreign Armies East, Section 1. Secret. Abwehr Unit reports, April 13th. Member of Central Committee, Nosenko, has told editor of newspaper Pravda in conversation from Kibyshev that in the 1st joint session of the Central Committee's Presidium with the High Command, it has been decided to snatch the operational initiative from the Germans before they can launch their offensive. It was decided to go over to the offensive with the Red Army first on occasion of May Day festival. This report has taken a long time to reach us, it will be noticed. I showed it to General Halder on May 2nd. By then there were other indications that the Russians were planning to spoil our attack. And indeed, before we could start the planned second phase of our Caucasus offensive, the Red Army launched a sudden and concentrated assault at Kharkov on May 12th. Thanks to the War Department's and the General Staff's determination not to lose the initiative, however, the following 16 days saw an encirclement action at Kharkov, which ended with 2 Russian armies destroyed and 240,000 prisoners in our hands. To accomplish everything General Halder expected of us, it proved necessary to expand the staff of my branch and change its structure. From about 25 officers attached to Foreign Armies East at the time I took over, it expanded to about 50 by the end of the war. As principal assistant, or operations officer, I took Lieutenant Colonel Baron Alexis von Roen. Von Roen was a tall, fair-haired, bespectacled Balt, with the superior air of a schoolmaster addressing pupils on a matter which was far beyond their comprehension. He could be very sarcastic to those he considered his intellectual juniors, but he was a fanatical enemy of the Bolsheviks and spoke a fluent and cultivated Russian, as well as passable French and English. I subdivided the branch into 3 groups. Group 1 was under Major Heinz Danko-Herre, a tall, athletic officer with fading blonde hair, who, like von Roena, was a highly qualified Russian-speaking staff officer. This group was responsible for the daily enemy intelligence digest. Group 1 was again subdivided into 1 subgroup for each of the army groups on the Eastern Front. Group 2, under Major Kuline, dealt with long-term assessment of the enemy's position. It assembled information from other agencies and analyzed the facts necessary for an evaluation of every aspect of the enemy's capacities relating to war. For example, manpower, arms production. The group owned a magnificent library of books and documents from all over the world and kept permanent files of statistics which were brought constantly up to date. After the German defeat in 1945, this collection formed the starting point for my colleagues and myself when we established the Galen organization. Group IL, which was run by a Captain Peterson under the supervision of von Roena, consisted of our experts on Russia. They were a remarkable group, shrouded in an air of conspiracy, and with a penchant for throwing drinking parties on the most tenuous of pretexts. They had an ill-deserved reputation for sloth, but in fact their accomplishments were many. Most of them were Baltic Germans or Germans who had been born in Russia. They knew the terrain, and to them Russian was a second mother tongue. Among them were many outstanding Russian experts, for instance Wilfried Strickfeld, a 45-year-old former Tsarist officer born in Riga, who had fought against Germany in the Great War. The group was responsible for all translating and the considerable Russian interpreting work in the prisoner interrogation camps, for example. Russian military manuals and documents were translated and circulated to our own field commands. On one occasion, in July 1943, We captured a SMERSH counter-espionage manual advising Russian units how to detect parachutists, radio operators, saboteurs, and other German espionage agents. It was translated by Group IL, and we modified our tactics and forged documents accordingly. T. The commanding officer of Group 3 controlled the interrogation camp maintained by foreign armies east at Lotzen, East Prussia. Altogether, the group was of particular importance, since there were few experts on the Soviet Union in Germany, and our own leaders had to be kept well advised on everything connected with the Russian enemy. Within a few weeks, the new system was working well. During the course of the day, the intelligence data and digests arrived from all the army groups on the Eastern Front. The dispatches from Major Baun's office, Wally 1, were rushed over from Nikolaiken by an NCO dispatch rider on a motorcycle. Baun himself was rarely seen at Angerburg. These were processed by the individual groups within my branch in preparing the evening intelligence digest we were to issue. Many of the incoming reports had to be checked back on, and we had to issue follow-up orders to the reporting units at the front. Out of these incoming reports, we gradually digested an overall picture of the day's main events and established a basis for an assessment of the enemy's probable situation and intentions, even before we received the appreciation reports composed at Army Group level. The constant exchange of ideas between our branch and the Lee officers at Army Group level in the course of the day was of great importance. This was also the case for the exchanges between our branch and Major Baun, and our comparison of ideas with Holder's operations branch. By the time the military intelligence reports began to arrive from the army groups during the afternoon, the respective subgroup heads had already been able to form views of their own, which they compared with the new arrivals. In the evening, about an hour and a half before Holder called his main 10 p.m. situation conference, I summoned a branch conference in my room, attended by Major Hera, head of Group 1, and the heads of all his subgroups. Hera reported to me the latest news from the army groups, from aerial reconnaissance, from radio monitoring. These reports were always very bulky documents indeed, and from Wally 1, and the details were discussed with his subgroup heads. About a dozen officers clustered around the map table in my room, as each subgroup head reported on his own army group and outlined his views on that group's intelligence report. On the basis of this briefing, I then decided on the general line to be adopted by our overall daily intelligence digest, to be issued by foreign armies east. Under considerable pressure, this document was then produced, usually 2 or 3 pages long, and each evening I took it with me when I went to the main conference called by General Holder as Chief of Staff. All the General Staff branches concerned with the strategic situation were represented at Holder's conference. The heads of the operations, Foreign Armies East Organization and Rail Transport branches, the Quartermaster General for logistic problems, the Chief of Army Signals for communications, and on some occasions representatives of other branches. The head of the operations branch usually opened the proceedings, followed by myself as head of Foreign Armies East, and then, after the others had also reported, Holder would decide on the orders and other measures to be issued. At about 9 o'clock the next morning, there was a further situation conference in my own office after the night's batch of incoming reports had been processed. This was followed immediately by a 10 o'clock situation conference called by Holder, similar to the evening one but shorter, based on the situation maps freshly printed during the night. He would then take this information with him to the main midday conference called by Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. Obviously, speed was of the essence if our intelligence digests were to be of any value to the field commanders. If this was true for offensive operations, it was even more so when the enemy had seized the initiative. I believe that the new organization and system I introduced met this vital requirement. From the daily digests, we also produced a comprehensive report on the enemy's situation, as I have mentioned, at intervals of 1 or 2 months. This long-range digest then farmed in its turn an important basis for comparison with the current daily digest. Any distinct divergence from the pattern established in the long-term digests acted as an early warning that the enemy was up to something. It was a warning system which would have been very difficult for the enemy to deceive. Any palpable increase in the rate of sabotage incidents or an increase in partisan activity, or a sudden concentration of espionage operations in certain areas, acted as an immediate alarm signal to my branch. We reacted by issuing orders for intensive intelligence effort in the particular sectors of the Eastern Front concerned. Armed reconnaissance units crossed the lines and pulled in Soviet prisoners, and our monitoring units eavesdropped on the enemy's radio traffic near the front lines. The radio communications of the particularly officious Soviet military police units were always rewarding listening in this respect. So, in achieving our results, neither I nor my colleagues resorted to black magic. It was application, thoroughness, expert knowledge, and speed that made our intelligence digests so valuable for the war. This did not mean that our reports were always in accord with Adolf Hitler's wishful thinking. I myself briefed him on only 4 occasions. The rest of the time it was usually the duty of the Chief of Staff, first Halder, then his successors Zeitzler and Guderian. I can only confirm how manfully my superiors battled with this man, trying to reverse decisions that were obviously wrong. But given a man of Hitler's obstinacy, they were the kinds of decisions that frequently only the force of destiny could alter. Again and again, Hitler dismissed the warnings contained in our reports as defeatism, and hinted that we were trying to sabotage his plans. The Chief of Staff always did what he could to shield me from such outbursts, which might otherwise have resulted in my peremptory dismissal. My own few meetings with Hitler all passed placidly enough, but Guderian frequently got the rough edge of his tongue. I well recall one occasion when Guderian went to Hitler's headquarters at the end of the unsuccessful Ardennes offensive in January 1945, a few days before the Soviet invasion of Germany proper began. When he returned, he vividly described how the Führer had thrown my charts and situation report to the ground, and had suggested that I belonged in a lunatic asylum. One vital question mark hung over the first half of 1942. How many new divisions could the Russians still create from their reserves? My predecessor had assembled a file of unmistakable indications that the flow of reinforcements to the front was drying up, and he had tried to determine whether this was because the Russians had no fresh manpower reserves available, or whether this indicated they were secretly creating fresh units somewhere to hold in reserve for the summer operations. There were many indications from the interrogation centers and from radio monitoring that workers were being recruited from industry to fight at the front, and in February 1942